Good evening. I'm Susan Craighead, President of the League of Women Voters of Naperville. How do you know when your democracy is in danger, and how should you respond? Our guest tonight will discuss that and many other questions regarding the state of democracy around the world. Dr. William Muck is the chair of North Central College's Political Science Department, as well as the coordinator for the college's Global Studies program. He teaches a variety of courses on international politics and foreign policy. His scholarship focuses on international security, the practice of military intervention, and the pedagogy of promoting civil engagement. He's been active in presenting research at various international study conferences around the world. In 2018, Bill was named a Ruge Fellow by North Central College for his contributions to teaching and learning on campus. He is co-author of the book, Technology and Civic Engagement in the College Classroom, as well as other articles on international security and higher education pedagogy. If you are in the Chicago area, you may have seen Bill on ABC7, CBS Chicago, Fox 32 Chicago, or WGN Evening News, offering political analysis. He is also a regular guest host for WCPT 820 AM radio. You can also listen to him on his weekly podcast, The Politics Lab. And now, let me introduce Bill Muck.
Well, it is so wonderful to be with you all today. I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see the presentation. Let's see here. Thumbs up, we can see this. All right, fantastic. So, all right, yes, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today. I'm delighted to talk, and I think it's a really, really important time to be talking about democracy and thinking about democracy and the state of our democracy. So my plan for tonight is that I'm gonna walk through what we're seeing both in the United States, but also globally. What do we know about democracy? What is happening in other countries in terms of how their democracy is functioning? What does that mean for the United States? And my hope is that we can see some patterns. So I'm a political scientist by training, and so I look for patterns. And I think when we look at democracy, both in the United States and what we're seeing around the world, some clear patterns emerge. And I think they help us understand what's happening here, and then also how we understand how to respond to that. A couple of things. I was talking to Susan beforehand. I'm going to present a lot of slides and show some really interesting data. I encourage you as we are going through the presentation, if you have a question about something or you want to ask about it, feel free just to holler out. You know, if you want to post something in the comments, that's fine too, but don't hesitate to yell and say, hey, I have a question, and we can talk through it. I'll also make sure to leave some time at the end to have questions as well, but we don't always have to wait for that. The other caveat I will offer before diving into the presentation is that I'm going to ground my talk today in the political science literature. What do we as political scientists know about democracy? What do we know about the history of democracy, both development and democratic backsliding? In doing so, I'm going to level some pretty harsh critiques of the Trump administration. And feel free to push back or ask questions about that. But I just want to be clear that I'm not leveling those critiques in a partisan way. I'm doing so in terms of what we understand in terms of the field and the research and the scholarship of political science and how that helps us understand the world that we live in. So, which doesn't mean we can't have some good back and forth in conversation, but I just want to sort of frame this that I'm thinking about these questions less as a partisan and more as a political scientist. And I think that's sort of useful as we think through some of these issues. So, all right, well, let us dive in. I'm going to start by showing you so Samuel Huntington he passed away a few years ago, but he's a political scientist who studied democracies. And one of the things that he found is that if you look at the history of democracy, there have been three waves, three important moments when we've seen a development and an increase in the number of democracies. And the first phase or wave was really that era when Western Europe and the United States moved toward democracy. And as you can see on the slide here, that's in the early 1900s, late 1800s. We're seeing a number of democracies that are moving, or a number of countries that move towards democracy. Now, the second wave where we see a whole bunch of democracies emerge is after World War II. That's not entirely surprising, right? Thinking about the transition that occurs because of World War II. So we see a bunch of democracies there, and we refer to that as the second wave of democracy. And then after the Cold War, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we see what is known as the third wave of democracy. So these three sort of separate waves. Now, the big point to take away from here is that when you look at this, well, it's not a perfect linear line. It does seem that as time goes by, we're seeing more and more democracies. And so if we were having this conversation in the mid 90s, the argument that I and other political scientists would be making is that we're just going to see more and more democracies, and the wave or the data seems to suggest that democracy is going to continue on, and we should only expect to see more democracies as time goes by. Now, unfortunately, that's not happened. And we find ourselves in a moment when we are seeing real democratic decline, both in the United States and globally. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through a little bit of data. So there are a number of organizations that track democracy around the world. And I'm guessing many of you have heard of Freedom House. This is a big one. It's been around a long time. And they do reports every year on every country, and they assign them a democracy score. And they're really good at it. And we'll talk about some of their data. The other one, which you may be less familiar with, is what's called the VDEM Institute, or Varieties of Democracy. They also go out and measure democracy in every country around the world. And they have a slightly different way that they measure democracy. It's similar, but again, a different approach to sort of understanding democracy. And I think by looking at what both of these organizations are finding in terms of global data about democracy, we get a much better sense of what's really, really happening. And the point, and what we'll get to in both of these, is that we're seeing a decline globally in democracy scores. So it's not just the United States, globally, we're seeing a decline in democracy. Let's start with this map. So some of you may have seen this map before. This is the Freedom House. This is from 2024. This is their map of freedom in the world. Let me explain it a little bit. Green are those that are free, the countries that are free. The sort of orange yellowish ones, those are partly free. And then the purple is not free. And so as you look at the map, I think what jumps out at you is there's a lot of purple out there. And there's more purple now than there was 10 years ago or there was 20 years ago. So we've seen an increase in the number of states that are not free. We have also seen an increase in the number of states that are partly free. So if you look at the map, there's a lot of interesting dynamics here. You know, we still see, like in the Americas, lots of green. When you go and you jump to Africa, you see there's lots of purple. The Middle East and Central Asia, you see lots and lots of purple. But if you notice where India is now categorized as partly free. And for many, many years, they were the world's biggest and largest democracy. And now Freedom House says they are not a full democracy anymore. They are a partly free democracy. And so we've seen that in a number of countries. And this is, I think, rattled democracy scholars to see a number of countries make that transition either from democracy to partly free, and then ultimately from partly free to not free. So I think this is sort of the big picture that has a lot of people worried. Now, let me explain this one, because when we look at this, it seems a little complicated. This is what Freedom House is doing in terms of the number of countries that have improved their democracy scores versus the number of countries that have decreased their democracy scores from 2005 to basically 2023. So if we look where the arrow is, in 2005, there were 83 countries whose democracy got better. That's wonderful, right? That's what we want. We want to see a big, long blue line. We want to see like 83 countries every year getting better and better. Now, the bottom side means that that same year in 2005, 53 countries got worse. Now, when you look past 2005, basically 2006, all the way to 2023, what we see is that there are more democracies that are declining than there are improving. You know, so for every particular year, you're seeing that there are, anywhere between 60 and 70 countries whose democracy scores are going down, and then maybe only 30 or 40 countries whose democracy is getting better. And so we see this 18-year trend of a decline in global democracy. Also really, really, really concerning and troubling. So, all right, one more slide here. This is looking at going back to that first map and showing the total population of the world that lives either in a free country or a partly free or not free. And what we see here is that 8 in 10 people in the world today live in either a partly free or a not free country. So again, the flip of that is only 20% of the world's population now lives in what Freedom House categorizes as a free country. That's really, really troubling. And so here's another way to look at this. This is sort of just zooming in on it as a circle graph. You can see 38% of the world lives in not free, 42% lives in partly free, and only 20% of the world's population now lives in what we would consider, or what Freedom House considers, a free country. That's one of those things when you think about that number, it's really humbling. A big part of this transition has been India. When India transitioned from a free country to a partly free country, you started to see that more and more of the world's population is not living in a free country. So when we think about this, the assumption is that freedom is spreading, but the data suggests something else, that we're actually seeing a relative decline in freedom around the world, and it has people worried. All right, let's jump and let's look at some of the data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute. So they publish annual reports looking at different data here. And the one thing that I kind of want to highlight is in 2021, they looked at the overall level of democracy in the globe. And they found the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2021 is down to 1989 levels. So the last 30 years of democratic advances that occurred at the end of the Cold War have all been eradicated. So after the end of the Cold War, we saw this wave of democracy spread across Eastern Europe and actually other parts of the world, Africa as well. All of those advancements that occurred after 1989 have come back. And we're essentially at the same point in terms of democracy that we were at in 1989, where they conclude that dictatorships are on the rise. And they put their figure at 70% of the world's population, or 5.4 billion people, live under unfree conditions or dictatorship. So Freedom House says 80% live in partly free. The Varieties of Democracy has a slightly lower number at 70%. But again, huge majorities of the world no longer living and operating in what we would consider free societies. And you can look at this and measure this in a variety of different ways. One of the things they look at is toxic polarization. And if you're not sure what toxic polarization is, just look at American politics today, right? I mean, we are a classic example of toxic polarization, extreme media opposition, very, very contentious. The other side is the evil enemy. And in 2011, they found that there were only 5 countries that would be categorized as toxic polarization. And by 2021, there were 32 countries. So, there's more of what we're seeing in the United States is spreading to other countries around the world, this idea of this sort of intense toxic polarization. Similarly, the number of countries threatening freedom of expression. In 2011, there were only 5 countries. That was actually a really, really good thing to think that there were only 5 countries. By 2021, there were 35. The United States is one of those countries where we are threatening freedom of expression. And you start to think about that, like what's happening globally is there are fewer and fewer, or there are more countries who are under threat for freedom of expression. And again, here's that map of the world where in 2011, they said that there were 49% of the world's population living in autocracies. And by 2021, that had jumped to 70%. So again, the big picture here is that the hope was that democracy would continue to spread around the world. And what we've seen is basically since about 2010, we're starting to see dramatic declines in the overall level of democracy around the world, which again has people concerned. But I think for our purposes, it helps us understand that what we're seeing in the United States is not something that's just unique to the United States. We are part of a global dynamic that is playing out. All right, so let's talk briefly about the United States. So our score this year from Freedom House, or the 2025 score, is an 84. It's a B, a solid B. It is up 1 point. Last year we were 83, so we've seen an improvement to 84. I have a significant fear that when the next year's score comes out, we're going to see a real decline in the United States for some of the reasons I'll highlight later. But so the United States is at an 84. What's troubling is that if we go back to 2010, the United States used to be a 94. So we were a strong democracy, very high score in a variety of different measures on the Freedom House methodology there, and we've dropped from 94 to 83 or 84. So there's a precipitous decline in the United States. Um, this is another way of looking at it. So this is looking at basically from 2008 to 2016. And why I show this is it's very easy to say that this is all Donald Trump's fault, right? That Donald Trump has caused all of this. And I will make an argument that Donald Trump is a danger to democracy. But what we see here is that the democratic decline in the United States began well before Donald Trump came into office. And it really, we're really looking at around, 2009, 2010. That's when we begin to see the decline, right? So, I think that, there's always that joke, thanks, Obama. I don't think this is entirely Obama's fault, but I think it speaks to when Obama became president, we started to see the emergence of this toxic polarization. And again, we can talk a little bit about why and maybe the roles of race and all of that. But that was really the beginning point where the U.S. democracy starts to move in a really, really dangerous direction. All right, this is one of my favorite charts. It seems really weird and confusing, and that's why I'm going to walk you through it. But once we're through it, I think you're going to see it's really, really interesting. This is looking at the percentage of different generations who think living in a democracy is important. So, for instance, here, 86%. So my grandparents, so if you look at that generation, that older generation, people in their 80s and 90s, you ask them, is democracy important? Right? How important is it to live in a democracy? Almost 90% of them say it's really, really important. So that older generation, you ask them, is democracy important? They say yes. It's one of the most important things. Now, if you were to ask my parents, you'd get a slightly less strong answer. They would say, well, they would, like between 75 and maybe 80% of them would say, yeah, democracy is important, but they're not as adamant about it as my grandparents would be. Now, this is me, my generation, right? So if you ask people in their 40s and 50s, 69, 70% of them will say that, yeah, democracy is important. But what we're seeing is a decline. And then when you look at, so my students' generation, if you ask them how important is a democracy, it's much, much lower, 50%, right? I mean, so you're seeing this dramatic transformation. People today, when you ask them, older generations think democracy is important. Younger generations are not so convinced that living in a democracy is an important thing. And there are reasons for that. When I talk to my students, they oftentimes say it doesn't feel like the democracy reflects my interest. It doesn't seem like it responds to the things that I worry about. So younger generations, both liberal and conservative, are less adamant about democracy being a great and only system. They would say, well, hey, if we could move away from a democracy, but the things that matter to me were addressed, I wouldn't be so troubled. Right. And so when I look at this, the decline in support for democracy as an institution, this rattles me, right? This idea that as the younger people are less supportive of democracy than older generations. So that, again, we sort of speaks to the moment that we find ourselves in. All right. This sort of won't surprise anybody. 60 to 70% of the American public thinks that democracy is in trouble in the United States. And in both Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, if you ask them, is democracy in trouble? They'll say yes. Now, they have very different reasons for that. Liberals have a concern about Donald Trump undermining democracy. Conservatives have a concern that Democrats are trying to steal democracy. But everybody is worried that democracy is in crisis. So that's one thing we can all agree on, is that democracy is in crisis, but we have very, very different interpretations for why that is the case. All right. This is really interesting. So if there's one book I'm going to recommend for you today, it's this book, How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They're political scientists at Harvard. But they wrote this book that is very, very accessible. It's not meant for academics. It's not very wonky. It's just talking about when we see democracies go away, what are the causal factors? And what's really important and really interesting about this is that we live in an era where democracies die very, very differently than they did 35 or 40 or 50 years ago. So if we go back to the Cold War, the 70s and 80s, democracies died when men with guns showed up and ended those democracies, right? So you think about examples of Chile in the 1970s, right? The military steps in and your democracy is ended. It was easy to see, and you no longer had a democracy. It's very different today. What we see today is that democracies are undermined by candidates who are elected through that democratic process. So Democrats, people who are elected, use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy itself, right? So individuals are elected, popularly elected, and then they proceed to make changes that slowly, almost imperceptibly, chip away at democracy. It's much, much more difficult to understand when your democracy is in trouble today because there aren't the men with guns, right? It's easy when the men in guns show up and you're like, oh, those guys are ending our democracy. Now it's more like the frog in the boiling water. You don't really know what's happening. But around the world, what we see is individuals who've been elected in through a democratic process then use that power to slowly chip away at the democracy. All right, so in this book, Levinsky and Zablat highlight 4 things. They say if any one of these things is going on in your democracy, you need to be freaked out. Like if any one of them, these are the alarm bells and you need to start thinking about them. So let's kind of walk through each of these 4 and then we'll compare them to what we're seeing in terms of the current administration. So, all right, number 1, rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. Do they attempt to undermine the legitimacy of elections, for example, by refusing to accept credible results? Do they reject the Constitution or express a willingness to violate that? And I think if we apply this to our current administration, if we think about what's going on and we think about the Trump administration, I think we've seen that. January 6th was an example of attempting to undermine the legitimacy of elections. Donald Trump last week was asked whether he had to follow the Constitution and due process, and he said, I don't know. So it raises a specter that the sitting president has rejected, or at minimum, a weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game. All right, number 2, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. Do they describe their rivals as subversive or opposed to the existing constitutional order? Do they claim their rivals constitute an existential threat, either to national security or the prevailing way of life? Do they baselessly describe their partisan rivals as criminals? Right? And as we think about that, and again, as we think about Donald Trump, this is a classic tactic that Trump has used going all the way back to his campaign in 2015. As we think about the refrain, lock him up. Or lock her up, I should say, right? And then, so Donald Trump has used this regularly. And for Levinsky and Zablat, they say this is really concerning because what's important about a democracy is that you don't demonize. You don't turn the other side into the enemy. You have conflict them, you want to win elections, but at the end of the day, if you lose that election, what's so important in a democracy is to say you accept those results, and then you say, I'm going to fight again another day. So when you start to see politicians within a democracy reject the legitimacy of their opponents, they would argue that the democracy is in a dangerous place. Do candidates tolerate or encourage violence? Have they or their partisan allies sponsored or encouraged mob attacks on opponents? Have they endorsed violence by their supporters? And I think, again, if we think about Donald Trump here, I think we see that he has both tacitly and sort of more directly been comfortable using language and talking about violence, right? And so, again, this is something that has them worried about what the implication of that for the democracy might be. And their final factor that they highlight is readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Have they supported laws or policies that restrict civil liberties, libel or defamation laws? Have they attacked the media? I think this is another one where, if we're being honest, I think we've seen the Trump administration be very proactive in going after media outlets and attacking them and threatening them. So it leaves us in a situation where we think about all 4 of these. It is fair to say that the U.S. democracy is under attack, right? And that there are some major things to be concerned about. So Levinsky and Zablat think that the United States needs to sort of dramatically reassess where we're at and try to think about improving those democratic institutions. One of the things I think is sort of fun to think about is populism more widely, right? We can think about Donald Trump as a classic populist candidate. Populist candidates are candidates that offer simple solutions to complex problems. And we see populists on the left and we see them on the right. Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, he was a populist on the left. Viktor Orban from Hungary is a populist on the right. So they're offering simple solutions to complex problems, and they can do so either through, a liberal or a conservative lens. When do we see these candidates doing well? Well, there's a really interesting formula, right? So you think about, is your country, does it have socioeconomic discontent? Is there economic trouble? Is there sociological trouble? Are people worried about their livelihood? Do you have that? Plus, do you have an ineffective government? So do you have real social, economic, and political problems, but do you have a government that is very ineffective at solving those problems? And when you have that, you create the space where populist candidates can thrive. And so, if we think about the American democracy, it is not at all surprising that we've seen a candidate like Donald Trump, because we have massive socioeconomic discontent. We have economic concerns. We have long-standing conversations about race and gender, all of those things that we are divided on. And we have a government that hasn't always been effective in addressing those concerns. And when that happens, you create the space for a populist candidate who then gets elected democratically and then uses the tools of democracy to undermine democracy itself. So again, this is a lot of what political scientists are thinking about, and this is how we understand what we're seeing in the United States and also globally. All right, I want to talk a little bit about, so this is something that the Founding Fathers, right? The Founding Fathers were thinking a lot about this as they were writing the Constitution. In Federalist Number 1, Alexander Hamilton warned of leaders who begin paying an obsequious court to the people, demagogues, and ending tyrants, right? So they were thinking about creating a system that would prevent populist demagogues from rising to power. So going all the way back to the founding, they were certainly thinking about some of these challenges as well. And I think what we're seeing globally today is a number of those candidates globally. So, all right, so here's what we're doing. I'm going to take just a few minutes to kind of walk through and show you some of the other candidates that are very much like Donald Trump, because the reality is what we're seeing is there are Donald Trump-like candidates, populist demagogues that we're seeing emerge all over the world. And once we see them and sort of understand them, we realize, other than Canada has actually done a pretty good job of managing their populist demagogues. And in this last election, now Justin Trudeau has stepped down, but even in this last election, I think we saw that Canada has done a better job of managing populism than the United States has. So all right, so as we think about the world, we have Donald Trump, certainly classic example of a populist. But we also have seen populists in Latin America. So Hugo Chavez, who once he died, he basically used the populist tools to get in power and undermine a democracy. When he died, Nicolas Maduro took over, and they have also undermined the democracy using the tools of democracy. So what did they do when they came into power? Hugo Chavez undermined the Supreme Court, took control of the legislature, like slow democratic procedures to undermine the strength of that democracy itself. So very, very effective in terms of undermining that democracy. But we've also seen a variety of populists all across Europe. Poland is currently governed by the Law and Justice Party, or actually, for a number of years has been governed by the Law and Justice Party. There was actually a shift more recently, but they engaged in, I think, what we would understand is classic populist techniques. We've seen in Hungary, Viktor Orban is a perfect example of a populist candidate. He has openly said that he wants to pursue an illiberal democracy, that he believes that, democracy, a full-fledged democracy is in fact dangerous. He wants to have an illiberal democracy. We could talk about Erdogan in Turkey also having some very, very similar dynamics. Austria, a few years ago, Austria almost elected this guy named Norbert Hofer. The platform he ran on, he said he wanted to be Austria first. He talked about stopping the invasion of Muslims, and he wanted to build a fence on Austria's southern border. Now, that should feel very similar or familiar to American ears. America first, stopping the invasion of Muslims, building a fence, right? So these are tactics that we're not just seeing deployed in the United States, but we're seeing deployed by candidates all over the world. Marine Le Pen has been an opposition candidate who's gotten close to winning the presidency a couple times and continues to be a formidable candidate. Geert Wilders is in the Netherlands, and he has did marvelously well in a recent election. And he has been open about talking about the Quran as a fascist book, very, very anti-Muslim in his perspective. He talked about banning it, compared it to Mein Kampf. And I think what's sort of interesting about him is if you sort of look at him, he kind of looks like Donald Trump, right? You know, there's sort of a type here where you see a similar dress, a similar approach, similar hair. Many of them socialize, so that's Marine Le Pen down there. So there is a growing global community where a lot of populists continue to engage each other on their ideas, and they are trying to stoke a more global movement of populism. Vladimir Putin. I think we could talk about Vladimir Putin as sort of fitting the mold of this in terms of when he came to power, he used the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. The not the current, but the previous president of the Philippines was this guy named Rodrigo Duterte. And he absolutely engaged in very, very populist tactics. He talked about that he was going to kill all of the drug dealers and carried out extrajudicial murders of many, many drug dealers, not through the normal legal process, but just used violence to target them, and would talk openly about that, you know, using that sort of as a tool to garner political support for that. He kept talking about wanting to close Congress, but he was a populist. So he said, I'm going to close Congress, but I'll give all the money to the teachers, right? So they sort of pay attention to these populist messages. He openly talked about how he had multiple girlfriends and this didn't hurt him at all, right? I mean, so they violate the traditional norms of elections, and that ends up leading to electoral success. He called out the Pope. The Pope came to the Philippines and caused all sorts of traffic jams, and he came out and openly was criticizing the Pope, and actually bared or got some political benefit for that, right? So the point of all this is that as we start to think about these candidates, what we realize is that Donald Trump is not alone. Donald Trump is merely one of many of these candidates that we're seeing all over the world. Another example, real quickly, is Brazil, the previous president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. He was a classic example of a right-wing populist demagogue. So he came to power, won a presidential election. I'm just going to show you a couple of the things that he said and campaigned on before being elected. This was actually, he was during a campaign rally, he was stabbed. So this was a picture of him from the hospital. But one of the things he ran on, he said, you won't change anything in this country through voting. Nothing. Absolutely voting. If a few innocent people die, that's all right. That's a very open statement that democracy and voting isn't the solution. He said he is pro-torture, and the people are too. All right, so he's anti-voting, he's pro-torture. He said he had 4 sons, and then he had a moment of weakness, and the 5th was a girl. Now, he says this during the campaign. He is not hiding any of this language. He said he'd rather have his son die in a car accident and have him showing up dating some guy, right? So homophobia as well, right? So these are all things that he is saying publicly. There was a time when he was a member of Congress, and there was another woman member of Congress, and he came up to her and they were having an argument, and he said, I'm not going to rape you because you're very ugly. He said that publicly where people could hear it. It was reported. These were not secrets, and he was elected with 55% of the vote. Right. So we start to think about the pattern that we are witnessing. Jair Bolsonaro is just part of this broader pattern of populists who are rejecting the norms. Jair Bolsonaro has close ties to Donald Trump. They would tweet at each other. Trump sent down the national security advisor to congratulate Bolsonaro on his victory. So we see this pattern and this network of these populists connecting with each other. So in some ways, it should make us feel good that we're not alone, right? There are a lot of these candidates out there, and helps us understand what they all look like. All right, a few more things, and then we can go to the questions. But we talked about Levitsky and Ziblatt. So Levinsky, and Ziblatt, who are Harvard political scientists, Lucan Weiss, another political scientist, they wrote this piece in the New York Times this last week talking about how we know when we've lost our democracy. And one of the things they talk about, when they describe the United States, they say we have drifted into what we would accurately describe as competitive authoritarianism. And they say we are no longer a fully functioning democracy. We are more accurately described as a system of competitive authoritarianism. And that is a system in which parties compete in elections, so you still have elections, but the systemic abuse of the incumbent's power tilts the playing field against the opposition. So again, you still have elections, you still have opposition parties, but those in power tweak the rules, the process, the democratic institutions to make it more difficult for the opposition to win. That's what we've seen in Hungary. That's what we've seen in Russia. That's what we saw in Venezuela. That's what we saw in Poland for a while. Now, it's not impossible for the opposition to win. Sometimes the opposition does win, which happened in Poland, but it's more difficult to do so. And they argue that if you look at the history of democratic backsliding and then you try to understand where the US fits in that model, they say competitive authoritarianism is in fact what the United States is now. And they say, how? How do you know? Like, how do you know if you've crossed the line into an authoritarian or a competitive authoritarian system? And they say it's very, very simple. If you want to understand your democracy, you ask the question, what is the cost of opposing the government? And I think this is a really, really interesting question. And I think if we're honest and think about what we've seen in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, the cost of opposing the government has gone up. And we can think about this in a couple different ways. I think about a couple institutions and entities that have been targeted. Law firms. So the Trump administration has targeted a number of law firms because they either defended Democratic politicians or were part of the investigation of him, making it more difficult for them to get jobs, to get government contracts, banning them from entering federal buildings, suspending their security clearances, making it very difficult for individuals in those law firms to do their job. That effectively raised the cost of opposing the government. Colleges and universities. What have we seen the Trump administration do? Pull federal funding. So grants that go to many, many colleges and universities across the country, many of them suspended, if the administration doesn't feel like they're supporting the right particular political positions. We can think about the case of Harvard, where Harvard has been targeted. The administration has threatened to pull the tax-exempt status of a number of higher education institutions. The cost of opposing this government goes up when those actions are taken. The media. I mean, thinking about the ways in which the Trump administration has made things more difficult for media outlets, whether that's CBS, who's been targeted with a lawsuit, or ABC, which settled a lawsuit. We think about the Associated Press, who for a while was not allowed into press briefings because they refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, right? The cost of opposing that government went up for that media outlet. Current and public officials. The administration has gone after previous public officials for disagreeing with the Trump administration. He has suggested with Chris Krebs, who was in charge of cybersecurity during the first or in the 2020 election, Trump has suggested that the attorney general should look into him as a real investigation, right? That is, again, that is raising the cost of raising the opposition to the particular regime. We could even think about, think about some U.S. senators. Murkowski in Alaska recently talked about how, it's difficult to push back, how we're all afraid. She used that line, we're all afraid. And afraid for both their political future, but I think some of them are also afraid for their own safety, right? So the cost of opposing has gone up. So I think as we think about a variety of these institutions, what we're seeing is that it is more difficult and more dangerous to challenge the Trump administration. And these political scientists and others have suggested that's a sign that your democracy is not in a good place. Now, what does that mean, right? What does that mean moving forward, and how do you respond to that? I think one of the things that political scientists have really been thinking about is it's important to begin the pushback. It is not inevitable that this democratic decline, both in the United States and globally, continues, but it will unless there is dramatic change instituted. And what does that mean? It's thinking about the levers of power. So some of that is thinking about the institutions of government, right? It means that places like Harvard have to push back. It means law firms have to push back. It means that Congress has to reassert itself. But I think it also means that the American public has to reassert itself and start the pushback process. And not as Democrats or as Republicans or as independents, as partisans. I think you push back as pro-democracy forces. And I think that's the one thing that we're starting to see is that the reality is that this shift that we've seen, the regime change we've seen in the United States is very, very dangerous. And that if the American public and these other institutions don't begin that process of slowing that down and reversing that change, it is very, very difficult to maintain a democracy. So I would say within the field of political science, there is grave concern about what we've seen in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And maybe on that moment, because I'm sure I have sort of provoked a couple questions, so maybe I'll wrap up at that point. And I'm delighted to have some conversations and to hear everybody else's perspective on that.
So I guess these are my questions, but my
Sure.
first question is clearly people are voting for these strong men or strong women. Uh, That to me is part of the mystery.
Yes. Well, and here, this is what's really interesting about what we've seen in this most recent wave of attacking democracies. People are voting for candidates who are going to undermine their democratic principles. And it sort of happens very slowly. But think about it, whether you are liberal or you're conservative, if a candidate came to you and said, "I will give you everything that you want," whether that's big government, small government, whatever your issues are, like, I can solve that. And it just means we have to move outside of the democratic process. What a lot of Americans are willing to do is say, yes, I want that. I'm less concerned about democracy than I am my identity or my politics. Partisanship and those issues are now more important than democracy. And so people are willing to use their democratic rights to elect candidates who may ultimately undermine those democratic rights. It seems really strange and weird, and it absolutely is, and it's really dangerous for the democracy long term, but absolutely it's happening here and elsewhere around the world.
So can you explain a little more about why your students seem to have
Yeah.
I don't know if disdain is the right word for democracy
I
or
would
how?
describe it more as an indifference. And it's interesting because for me, my whole perspective is you need to engage the process. You need to be an active citizen and you should be voting. But more than voting, you should be doing, a variety of things to engage and try to change and impact the process. But for them, many of them look at the system and say, things never change. My interests aren't addressed. My concerns aren't addressed. I see political politicians, whether they're Democrat or Republican, that don't meaningfully make my life better. My students right now are terrified about the prospects of getting a job. They really look at an economy that they say is not helping. They say they're swimming in debt from college and elsewhere, and a political system that doesn't seem to be worried about that. So they have these, what I would say, are real and genuine concerns, and then they look at a political system that doesn't seem to address those concerns, and so therefore they're less engaged. Not all of them. When you're on a college campus, there are still a lot of students who are really engaged, but we're seeing a decline in that engagement. I think that's troubling. It's bad. It's bad for a democracy.
Can you think of any comparable uh, times in the US history when democracy, other than the Civil War, has been at threat like this?
All right. So you hit the number one, right? So I think the comparable moment is the Civil War, although I don't think we're drifting towards that type of violence. But what I will say is that scholars, now I'm not a scholar of civil wars, but the scholars who are writing about civil wars do say that all of the circumstances for increased partisan violence are in the United States, and that we're not going to see a conventional war like we saw during the Civil War, but many of them say we have laid the kindling for future January 6th. Different varieties of that more sort of small scale violence. So I think the Civil War is a really interesting comparison point. The other one I would point to is the Red Scare and Joseph McCarthy. We saw a similar, I'm seeing some head nods out there, right? We saw a similar demonization of the political process and others. And Joseph McCarthy made himself by being a populist demagogue, by coming out and saying there are traitors within our country. And he launched himself and his career in doing so. And I think as we think about some of the tactics that Donald Trump has used, there are a lot of parallels there. Um, Previous US presidents, Democrats and Republicans, generally looked outside the country for enemies. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was our enemy. Afterwards, it was, the war on terror. The enemy was always somebody external to the United States. What Trump has done and why the change is so dramatic is he's turned us against ourselves, right? He has made the other side the enemy. And it's sort of feeding into this partisanship and a genuine feeling on both sides of the aisle that the other side poses this existential threat. And you need to do anything possible, including anti-democratic measures, to prevent the other side from getting to power. So yeah, so I think the Civil War and the Red Scare are the two moments that I think about in terms of comparable historical moments.
So I imagine we have a fairly high percentage of voters here tonight, just because of the topic. But what kind of actions can people take to turn this around aside from voting?
Absolutely. And voting is certainly one of the things, but I think we too often assume it's the only thing we should be doing. I think what really needs to happen and is a sort of national uprising pushing back against the changes that we're seeing implemented. And that means people in the streets, people organizing. So there are a lot of organizing events that are protesting. And my point in all of this is not don't go out there and protest as a Democrat. Or as a Republican, you're out there protesting, saying, I am troubled by these anti-democratic, small d, developments. I think that's really important. I will say some of the scholars who study civil resistance are saying that there need to be bigger activities as well, that there should be work boycotts, that there should be other activities like on a grander scale. People not showing up to work, people calling in sick, people protesting. I mean, it can't simply be rhetorical. There has to be real, tangible things that demonstrate the power of the American democracy to make those in power realize that they need to change course. Some of that also as we think about, reaching out to your local member of Congress. Democrat or Republican saying like, I do not appreciate the changes that are being made. If you feel like this is problematic, express those. Put pressure on those individuals. One thing we know about members of Congress is they want to get reelected. And there is a midterm that's not that far away. And if you are in a district where you could lose that seat, I think there are a lot of congressional Republicans, moderate congressional Republicans in the House and even in the Senate, who are worried about getting reelected. Those are pressure points. That's where you can put some leverage on those individuals to say, I want to see change, right? So I think all of those activities are the sort of things that need to happen now. I will say I'm a political scientist and I'm not somebody who believes that I should be advocating, people to be out in the streets, but I think the uniqueness of the moment does call for that type of activity at this point.
So how does gerrymandering work in that when we talk about who we're
Yeah.
voting for? Now, frankly, Illinois is a very
Yep.
gerrymandered state, so we need to acknowledge that. But
Absolutely.
how does that play out when we're trying to make change or protect our democracy?
It makes it a lot harder, right? I mean, as we think about what gerrymandering does, is it protects certain districts. And you're right, Illinois is gerrymandered. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is also gerrymandered. And in some ways, Wisconsin's a really, really interesting example because Wisconsin is a state that is truly purple. It's a 49-49 kind of state where it can go back and forth. And what we saw through the gerrymandering of the Wisconsin legislature is that Republicans were able to take, a super majority of that state legislature, for a long time, the Supreme Court, right? So, and what the impact of that is that your legislation does not reflect the will of the people. So even in Illinois, right, when you have a gerrymandered Illinois constituency, it means that you're not always reflecting the will of the people. And I think of all the problems we have, Gerrymandering is one of the first ones. If you gave me a magic wand and I could say I could change something, I would start with gerrymandering because it creates a distance between the voters and then their elected officials where they feel safe and protected. And I think that's not a good thing if we want reflective and responsive democracy.
So we used to believe that democracy made our lives and careers possible, those of us of a certain age. Do students realize how their lives might be under an authoritarian government, for example?
I don't think they fully appreciate. And here I would extend the question a little bit. I would say it's not just students. I think students certainly don't have that sense, but I think the population as a whole doesn't appreciate how dangerous this slide towards authoritarianism is. In terms of all of our rights. And again, I say that not as a Democrat or Republican, I think as somebody who's pro-democracy. What we've seen in these countries, look at Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is a shell of what it was. It is a country that has tremendous resources, and it's not able to feed its people. Hungary is another example where the anti-democratic elements of Viktor Orban have meant that the country is not doing well economically, it's not doing well politically, because populist demagogues don't actually really govern particularly well. They campaign really well, they're really good at winning over voters, but they're not particularly effective at governing. And I think one example of this in the United States is the conversation about tariffs. I'm not an economist, but I've been talking to every economist I can find recently to sort of think through this issue of tariffs. And is it, can these at all be a good idea? Liberal, conservative, independent economists, I can't find any of them who think this is a good idea. But this is a classic populist technique. Trump goes out there and says, I'm going to protect the American workers. I'm going to bring factories back. I'm going to bring manufacturing back. That helps get him elected. It's a really easy, wonderful, simple thing to say. But at the end of the day, if they proceed with these tariffs, the economic impacts on all Americans will be dramatic. Again, it strikes me as ineffective governance. But I don't know if Americans always appreciate that because populists are so seductive in their messaging.
Someone says, I worry that until our younger generation feel the pain from anti-democracy actions, they won't step up to defend democracy. How do you communicate the seriousness of the situation to a generation that seems not to care? For example, as long as I'm not affected, well,
Yeah. Right. I think it's a really good question. I would say two things. I think you have to continue to have the conversation about why democracy matters and the dangers of slipping into authoritarianism. And I think the other thing that has to happen is that our political system has to be better about thinking about the interest of young people as well. Because it's easy to be frustrated. And I sometimes get frustrated with my students, like, be more politically engaged. But also, they're operating in a political system that doesn't think about the challenges they face. So I think there's two sides. I think the students and young people need to be more politically engaged and fight for democracy. And I also think the elected officials need to think more about all constituencies, all age groups, and think about those young people as well and some of the struggles they have, especially as we think about marginalized groups. As I think about the views of my students, sometimes when I talk to my students of color, they have a very, very different experience. And they look at a democracy that doesn't care about themselves, right? Doesn't care about the challenges that they face. And I find that messaging sometimes I'm sympathetic to that. They feel like, hey, these are politicians who don't care about the struggles I have and don't implement legislation. So it's complicated. It's a hard thing.
so I think this is a little more of a comment.
Yeah.
The internet allows individuals with populist or fringe ideologies to reach great numbers of people without any kind of editorial control or accountability. These people are modern day Father Coughlins, except there are many more of them. The internet gives relatively unfettered access to the US electorate to foreign governments and anti-democratic agents. Its effect is overwhelming.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more because you think about how we communicate now and think about how that was different 30, 40 years ago when there were three major news organizations and everybody tuned in to Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite was the person who told you this is what's happening. Now we don't need that. We don't have to have common news sources. You can go out and find other fringe groups who have extremist views. I mean, it used to be if you were a conspiracy theorist or if you were an extremist, it was actually kind of hard to find other fellow extremists. Now you go out on the internet and it's much easier to create a sense of community among those groups. Social media also means that there's no longer, in the internet more broadly, a check on what is truth. And that's something that we see every day. We have different politicians saying, this is my truth, this is how I understand things. And the reality is, we have access to more information than any human beings at any point in history. But we also have more mis and disinformation than at any point in history. And that makes it difficult to have a functioning democracy. And I think this is a really important point. If you're going to have an effective democracy, you have to be able to agree on what is truth? What is fact? Or maybe what is fact? Maybe start there. And then talk about how do we respond to that? So we have a problem. Okay, do we solve that problem? We have a healthcare problem. Do we solve that with more government or less government? But we have to understand the foundation of facts before we can really begin to have solutions. And if we're all operating in our own ecosystems with different conceptions of truth and fact, really difficult to have an effective democracy.
Does racism fuel the populist movement here and around the world?
Yes. Yeah. So, what I would say is identity politics are so important. One of the things that we've seen, so I showed that picture of Obama, right, where the U.S. democracy started to decline. I think some of that, we have to grapple with the role of race and the role of gender and sexism, right? These things are still here and they are very powerful dynamics. And the reality is that we live in a country that is increasingly diverse. There's different backgrounds. We live in a world where women, and I think this is a wonderful thing, are now actually really doing well in school and getting good jobs and rising up. We are seeing a transformation. I really think the 21st century is the century of women, and this is astronomical. But for a lot of men, this is a challenge. And so as the country becomes more diverse, less white, as we see more women in power, I think part of the populist movement is a pushback against that. Think about the phrasing that Trump uses. He's going to make America great again. That's referencing going back in time. Then the question is, what are we going back to, right? We're going back to more traditional family structure. We're going back to a more traditional understanding of race and diversity. I mean, I think we can't understand any of sort of the movement of the MAGA movement and Trump in particular if we don't appreciate the ways in which race, gender, sexism, all of that are sort of feeding into this movement where there are people who see change around them and are terrified by it, are scared by that change. And Donald Trump comes along and says, it's okay that you're scared and we shouldn't have this change. And I'm going to take the world back to a time before all this change occurred. Again, really, really seductive to a significant chunk of the American population.
So I think there are two ways to look at this next question. What kind of message can the Democrats bring to challenge the Republicans in the next election? They really seem to be confused about what they
Yeah,
stand for and how to frame it. I would add to that, what could anybody who wants to save democracy do
yeah,
to push against the people who don't
yeah.
value democracy?
Right, absolutely. So I'll start with the Democrats, and the Marcia is absolutely right on in the sense that the Democrats don't know exactly how to push back, and I think there are two big approaches here. One is you run on Trump, right, and you say he's a danger, he's a danger, we need to stop him, but that's less about what the Democrats believe. And then the other strategy is if you're the Democratic Party, you articulate what that message is. I think they have to do both, right? I think the Democratic Party has to articulate what they believe in, and how that connects to the American public. Republicans in the last couple elections have been very, very good at their messaging during campaigns. I think the Democrats have been less effective in some of that messaging. And so I think they have to articulate who they are, but at the same time also really clearly state what the threat that is posed by Donald Trump. And then to Susan, to your point, I think the messaging of those like those of us who believe that this isn't necessarily a partisan issue, but it's a democracy issue, have to continue to articulate and talk specifically about the issues that are in danger. So, I work at a college, and colleges and university across the country are worried about the ways in which the government targeting these grants and all the research funding is going to impact the country. In terms of the health research that's going on, thinking about the innovation, all of this excellent and really important innovation that occurs at colleges and universities. When you cut that funding back, it's going to make our lives less good, right? We're going to suffer because of that. Law firms, if we're not able to go out and have somebody be defended by the best law firms, that's a loss for the country. So thinking about these very specific issues and the way in which they undermine, the attacks on the press to say we're all better off if the president is not threatening to take away the license of CBS. Like we need the press out there. They perform an important function. And even though presidents don't always like them, we need to preserve these things. And I think that's some of the messaging of the pro-democracy group should be spreading.
Do we have any other questions this evening? I feel like I've learned a lot. I don't know if I feel any better than I did before about our democracy, but it has been a great perspective. So thank you very much, Dr. Muck, and thank you to our audience for a lot of excellent questions. Remember, if you liked what you heard tonight, you can also always listen to the Politics Lab, which I understand releases on Wednesdays typically as your podcast. In addition, I'd like to say, if you enjoyed this program this evening, I hope you will consider joining the League and being a part of its civic and community work. Our Ideas Forum programming is taking a summer vacation. There will be no programming June and July, but we will be back in August. I hope that you will watch our voter newsletter and our website for upcoming programming. And once again, we have many people saying thank you very much and applauding. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to be here. One quick thought, and then I'll stop yapping. But I will say there's a sense of community as we come back as people start to push for democratic rights. And I think for those of you that are feeling disconnected, Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative, there's real community in fighting for your democracy. And I think that's an important point as well.
And I think we see some of that community here tonight. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Good night.